Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Rise of the Tomb Raider for PC, Xbox 360, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4. What you're seeing here is the PC version, specifically the 20-year Celebration Edition, which includes all of the DLCs. This is a third-person action-adventure game developed by Crystal Dynamics and published by Square Enix in 2015 for Xbox 360 and Xbox One, and it saw release on PC and PlayStation 4 the following year. And of course it is the sequel to the 2013 reboot of the entire franchise, which puts it into, I think, what is called the Survivor timeline by fans. And let's be fair here. The previous game in the series, the 2013 reboot, really was not a particularly good game. It wasn't bad either, but it had a ton of problems that were holding it back and made it really hard to outright recommend unless you got it for a really good price. This of course brings up the question of whether or not the sequel managed to overcome that problem and managed to become something that's actually worth getting at a higher price. Well, of course, the mainstream gaming press absolutely showered this thing in praise like they always do for a game like this, but then again, their reviews are about as useful as a crowbar is for solving complex quantum equations, so there's that. But enough mild jabs at the mainstream gaming press. I'm really more concerned about whether or not this game manages to overcome the problems of its predecessor and whether or not it's actually a good game. So let's go ahead and delve into this thing and find out. Well, as far as presentation goes, for the most part, it's actually pretty top-notch. The visuals are downright stunning at times, with an excessive amount of detail put into the environments in particular. The modeling is extremely well done, the texture quality is rather high, and for the most part, the animations are excellent. The only real issues you'll notice regularly are the times when the hair physics start to glitch out a bit and go a bit crazy, or the times when the animation cycles themselves glitch out a bit because it encountered a particular bit of the environment that it wasn't expecting. Or in the case of especially the DLCs, but also to some degree when you're actually running around doing stuff in-game, the lip syncing. Now, in the cutscenes, the lip syncing is fantastic. It is pretty much spot on. In the gameplay, they barely move their mouths at all, if at all. It's actually really jarring when you notice it, because you'll be sitting there minding your own business, playing the game, and then all of a sudden you'll be like, wait a minute. The characters aren't moving their mouths even though they're talking. It's weird. And it's directly at odds with how high the level of production quality is for everything else as far as the visuals go. I mean, the shaders look great, the lighting is fantastic, everything moves pretty organically in this thing, and it all looks great, except for the lip syncing outside of cutscenes and the occasional graphical glitch. Obviously, it's not enough to be a deal breaker or anything like that, but it is something that is kind of annoying when you do notice it. And the generally high level of production quality moves over into the sound design as well. The environmental sounds are great, although the gun sounds could certainly be a lot beefier. They don't have anywhere near enough bass to them, and in fact the guns end up sounding rather pathetic most of the time, even the shotguns. The explosions don't have enough beef to them either. They end up sounding more like dull thuds than anything else. But luckily things do improve once you get over into the music and the voice acting. The voice acting in particular is very well done in this thing. All of the actors do a very good job of conveying their roles. It's just that occasionally the lines they're saying are a bit stilted, more from the writing itself than the actual acting. But I'll talk about that more in a moment. But before we do that, the music is actually rather solid for this game as well. The problem is that it is rather forgettable simply because it's a fairly generic action-adventure oriented orchestral soundtrack, and while it does work rather well for the game within the game, it's not the kind of thing you're going to be listening to outside of the confines of the game. And apart from a couple of motifs that just keep playing over and over and over again throughout the course of the game, you're probably not going to be able to pick out any particular track from this game and go, oh yeah, that's from Rise of the Tomb Raider. Again, that's not to say it's bad music, it is in fact rather good music, it's just that it's a fairly forgettable soundtrack outside of the confines of the game. But of course what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is that you play as Lara Croft, this time about a year after the events of the previous Tomb Raider game, which was of course the 2013 reboot of the entire series. The events of the previous game have left her rather shaken and looking for answers, so she looks into her father's research where he was looking for the lost city of Kitezh, where he hoped he could find an artifact that supposedly bestowed immortality. But as it turns out, Lara and her father were not the only ones looking for the lost city of Kitezh. There's also an organization called Trinity that's looking for it. And the game makes it abundantly clear right from the get-go that these are bad dudes. Not only do they use violence to achieve their goals, but they really don't care who gets in their way or what they have to do to get to those goals. Now the problem with having them as antagonists is not so much that they are driven and will do anything that they deem necessary in order to achieve their goals, it's more that they tried to give them a religious angle and it ends up coming across as comical almost. It's kind of hard to take your antagonists seriously when they're a paramilitary organization that has a ludicrous number of people, apparently, and they are constantly going all Deus Vult and just smashing anything in their path. Especially when the primary antagonist straight up has stigmata. It's pretty ridiculous. But regardless of the weak and rather contrived antagonist, the plot will take Lara across the world as she searches for the lost city of Kitezh before Trinity can get there. Of course, it doesn't start you off against Trinity, it starts you off exploring a tomb in Syria trying to find the way to the lost city of Kitezh and to find this item called the Divine Source, which is the item that supposedly bestows immortality. That's where Lara encounters Trinity, and then from there, the rest of the game takes place in Siberia, where you're simultaneously trying to do three things: survive, find the lost city of Kitezh, and prevent Trinity from getting there. Much like in the previous game, they decided to throw in survival elements, which basically means that at the very beginning of the game, it forces you to hunt something, and it forces you to go find materials to craft with. That's about it. For this being the so-called survivor timeline, they don't really put a lot of emphasis on the actual survival elements of it, meaning that the rest of the game falls to finding the lost city of Kitezh and preventing Trinity from getting there, and the plot just kind of meanders all over the place until it finally gets to the climax, which is of course a similar problem to what the original had, except that it's considerably less of an issue here. Whereas the previous game basically went, suddenly here's the explanation of the myth, basically at the end of the game, it's much more of a gradual revelation as you go throughout Rise of the Tomb Raider. It works a lot better for a story about discovery and adventure to structure the plot that way, where you're gradually given more and more bits and pieces as you continue until finally everything is revealed at the end. The thing is, if you only went by the cutscenes, then it would be less structured than if you actually went through and explored everything and found as many of the old documents as you possibly could. Those really do help flesh out the game quite a bit more, and it really does incentivize you going off the beaten path in order to find all of the relics and all of the documents, so you get the full width of the story. Here's the thing though, while it is certainly a much better story than the previous game, it is more coherent, it is much easier to follow, and more importantly, it is a lot more interesting than what we saw in the previous game, because they decided to delve more into Lara's backstory and actually feature her as a proper character now, as opposed to someone who just whines the entire game like she did in the previous one. It unfortunately still comes off as a transition piece. You see, the original game was about Lara becoming a survivor, quote-unquote, and it did that in a ridiculously contrived and frankly rather stupid manner. Whereas this one is more about her embracing her past, embracing her family name, and becoming the full-on, quote-unquote, Lara Croft. It doesn't really handle that all that well. She certainly does monologue quite a lot about her father, and there are quite a lot of audio logs that he left behind that she's listening to throughout the course of the game. But the game does have a tendency to get wrapped up in the moment and not really consider the big picture all that much. This means that while each moment-to-moment might be pretty satisfying, the overall game is a bit of a mixed bag. It's certainly a better storyline that is told a lot better than the previous game, but unfortunately, it really does feel like they were just putting this together to set it up for another game in the series. Because Rise of the Tomb Raider doesn't really end so much as it concludes its individual storyline regarding the lost city of Kitezh, and then immediately after that it's like, okay, by the way, we're going on another adventure now. And while I understand why they did that, they obviously wanted to leave the game open for a sequel because they knew it was probably going to be successful and they knew they were probably going to be able to get a sequel out of it, it does still end up being somewhat of a disappointing ending. But at least the journey to get there isn't the often cringe-inducing nonsense that was the previous game. But of course the story is only one part of this game, and the rest of it is the gameplay, which is pretty much the same as the previous game in the series, but with a few slightly different tweaks. It's played from a third-person perspective. You have pretty basic third-person shooter combat with an automatic cover system, where if you move up to a cover-like object, then Lara will automatically take cover behind it. There's a lot of jumping, there's a lot of climbing, and there's even some puzzle solving thrown in there for good measure. You will notice the rather conspicuous change they made to the QuickTime events, however, which is to say there really aren't all that many of those anymore. In the previous game, they were absolutely rampant, whereas in this one, they're occasionally a thing, but most of the time, the game just lets you do your own thing, which is greatly appreciated because that was a major problem with the previous game. It put in way too many action set pieces, and the only real interactions you had with those were just doing QuickTime events, whereas in this one, it still has the action set pieces, but there's enough space between them that they don't feel like they wear out their welcome, and you don't have that serious problem of the game really trying to shove as many QTEs down your throat as possible. So the pacing's definitely an improvement over the previous game. So is the inclusion of several tombs to explore, which actually do require some puzzle solving to complete. Now admittedly, most of the times the puzzles are fairly obvious. Usually they're physics based, or they're a simple matter of moving things to the appropriate spot so you can climb up something. But it's exactly the kind of thing you would expect from a game that has Tomb Raider in the title. In the previous game, there were a few optional tombs scattered throughout the game, and they didn't really do much of anything for you, whereas in this one, there is a lot of incentive to actually go and do the optional tombs, because they actually give you additional skills. So for example, one of the very early tombs you go to will actually give you a skill that allows you to shoot 2 arrows very quickly. Now, of course, that may not sound all that exciting, but it does mean that there are tangible incentives for actually exploring the tombs now, rather than just leaving them be and going about your merry way. The problem is that almost all of these abilities that they give you are centered around combat, and the combat in this game is pathetically easy. And that's because it is the same combat system from the previous game, which means that you have a very light adaptive cover system where if you move up to something, you will take cover behind it, and of course you can lean over it and shoot at things, and headshots of course rule everything. If you get a headshot on almost any enemy in the game, they go down instantly. And it's not like they can take all that much damage to begin with either. Although they do eventually introduce a bit more variation with that, with enemies that don't go down in a single hit, or enemies that actually have certain gimmicks to them, like they have large riot shields that prevent incoming damage, so you have to find a way to get around the shield. The problem is that every situation the game throws at you is extremely easily circumvented because Lara is an unstoppable juggernaut of death. What's that? The enemy has a shield and you can't hit them? Why don't you shoot the ground next to them with a grenade arrow, or a rifle grenade, or a flaming arrow that will set them on fire and instantly kill them? What's that? You've taken quite a bit of damage? Well, use the bandage mechanic and instantly heal yourself. Having trouble getting a headshot? Well, there's a certain ability that whenever you're actually aiming at someone's head, it will instantly change the reticle to make sure you know that you're aiming at their head. In fact, it is so incredibly easy that quite literally the only times I died in it were when I was trying to make a jump and either I jumped wrong and just acknowledged that I jumped wrong, or I jumped and the game kind of glitched out a bit and didn't actually do what I wanted it to do. Now, of course, it glitching out was a pretty rare occurrence, but it did happen on occasion, and I wasn't entirely sure why, because the next time I tried it, it worked fine. So apart from basically 2 deaths throughout the entire game, the rest of my deaths were entirely because I would miss a jump. I didn't die in combat at all throughout the course of the game, and I was playing it on the hard difficulty, so that's actually not a good thing. The enemy AI is really not smart enough to compensate for having such low damage resistance. But the thing is, you don't want them to be bullet sponges, because then that would make all of the guns feel absolutely pathetic, and it would feel like you're having no effect on target. On top of the whole, it makes the combat system considerably more boring when the enemy can take a ludicrous amount of damage before going down problem. So really the best thing they could do to make the combat challenging would be to make the AI considerably better, where they'll flush you out of cover a lot better, they'll be able to find you a lot easier, but unfortunately they didn't really do that. Instead, half the time, they're pretty stupid, and they'll just wander around until you annihilate them instantly with a headshot or a melee kill or something along those lines. This means that the combat ends up being one of the weaker elements of the game, and like in the previous game, it is one of the deciding factors in whether or not you're going to be able to get much out of this. It's not an outright terrible combat system or anything like that. It does function, and it functions relatively well. It's just that it doesn't really have all that much oomph behind it. This means that you may want to try out the stealth system to see if that actually helps things out, but it really doesn't. It basically consists of, are you in the enemy's line of sight, or are you behind them, hiding in the bushes, or above them in the trees? If it's the latter, then most likely they're not going to spot you, and it's going to be really easy to take them out. If you are in their line of sight, however, most likely they're going to see you unless there's some other extenuating circumstance, and they are going to attempt to take you out. It's basically the same stealth system from the previous game carried over into the new setting, and while the setting does give you slightly different opportunities, it's really not enough to make the system actually better. Which is pretty much the same thing you can say for the combat system. It was basically ported over from the previous game, and it wasn't really improved. Oh sure, they give you plenty of new options to mess around with for the combat, but the actual system itself is not any better. No amount of craftable Molotovs or craftable stun grenades or the new bow types or new weapons that you can get access to is going to really fix that. And while it's certainly tolerable throughout the course of this game, mostly because the combat itself tends to be fairly short, it's the kind of thing where if they don't make noticeable improvements, not just adding on top of things, I mean noticeable improvements to the combat system and the stealth system in the sequel, then I'm not sure it can simply be tolerated anymore, because at that point they'd be blatantly ignoring the problems within the system, or they would just be incapable of fixing it. Now what they did manage to improve slightly is the exploration. Not only do you have more tombs in this game, but you have more ways to explore them. Things like the wire spool, which lets you use your ice axes as sort of grappling hooks, or being able to shoot an arrow into something and then swing across a ravine, or even being able to use special arrows to embed them into wooden surfaces so you can actually use them as climbing points. And when you blend it together, the exploration becomes actually kind of a joy. Looking at the environment, seeing what it gives you, and then figuring out what it wants you to do in order to progress is actually pretty enjoyable. Because unlike in the case of the various weapons and the throwables and such, where most of the new additions are all optional, the new movement mechanics are actually used throughout the course of the main story, not just in optional side content. Although the side content, specifically the tombs that you'll be exploring, is probably where you're going to find the most interesting uses of it. And oddly enough, navigating around the environments basically ends up being the best part of the game, simply because it's the most polished aspect of the game. Because the overhauled crafting system is not much more than busy work. All you have to do is find the various resources you need in order to build the various attachments you want for your guns and such, and that doesn't really add all that much to the game, it just makes it a bit more tedious. But hey, at least now you have a reason to wander around and find various objects and hunt things, so there's that. They also introduce side missions into the game where certain characters will give you a mission that you can go and complete for either an attachment or a skill or something along those lines. And while it is nice to have more content available in the game for you to mess around with on the side, it unfortunately doesn't really add all that much to the title. Instead, it's more of a convenient excuse to make you go and do a menial task in order to get an attachment that you probably won't even need. But they're fairly short missions and they don't really detract from anything because they are completely optional. They could have definitely done more with them though, use them to flesh out the backstory or just the actual story that's going on to give you more context as to what's going on in the world around you before and even during your presence there. Instead, it's basically the Rise of the Tomb Raider equivalent of another settlement needs your help. Though luckily they're not randomly generated and you only get basically 1 or 2, maybe 3 or 4 at most per area. So they don't really overstay their welcome, even though they don't really add all that much to the game either. And when you bring all of that together, you have a game that is in some ways better than the previous game in the series, but in other ways mostly the same. At least that's how the main single-player campaign is. There's also a few additional DLCs as well as an additional mode that I need to mention before we wrap this review up. First, let's talk about the survival mode, where the basic idea is that you have 2 meters that you need to worry about, which are hunger and the heat level. If you lose too much heat, then you eventually die, and if you go hungry, then you eventually die as well. The idea behind this mode is that you go in, you explore different areas, and you find the various relics, you bring them back and extract before you die. It's a rather straightforward mode that frankly doesn't really add all that much to the game, and it's also what replaced the multiplayer mode from the previous game. Multiplayer in the previous game sucked. It was just bare bones and bog standard at absolute best, and having that gone in this game is actually something of an improvement. Especially since they tried to work in something that is a lot more fitting for the tone of Tomb Raider. The problem comes in with the simple fact that the survival mode really is just not all that enjoyable. It feels really tacked on, and it doesn't really have a whole lot of polish going for it. And it also really doesn't help that the multiplayer in this game is completely dead at this point. You cannot find a game online anymore. Or at least I couldn't, which honestly doesn't surprise me. I wasn't really expecting people to stick around in the multiplayer section of this game for very long. Because the real emphasis of the game is on the single player, and to that end they have released a couple of DLCs for that. The first of them is a quest line that is put into the main single player campaign called Baba Yaga the Temple of the Witch. The idea there is that you investigate the local rumors of the evil witch Baba Yaga being present, and you try to find out the truth behind it and what's going on with that particular area, considering that anybody who ventures in there seems never to come back. And as far as side content for Rise of the Tomb Raider goes, it's actually a pretty decent DLC. Now the plot of it is a bit predictable, and it's not a particularly difficult DLC or anything, but it definitely adds some variety to the game, and it gives you an interesting side quest to do instead of the somewhat uninteresting side quests that you're given normally. So all in all, it's actually a pretty worthwhile addition to the entirety of Rise of the Tomb Raider. The second of the DLCs is called Cold Darkness Awakened, where you go into a Soviet weapons bunker to neutralize a toxin that Trinity has managed to find and might actually unleash upon you and your companions. And what that basically means in terms of gameplay mechanics is you go in, you go through a couple of towers, and you actually fight a crap ton of zombies. Because you gotta have zombies in everything, it seems. It's a pretty dumb DLC, and it really does not add much to the game at all, although if you are looking to get some goofy arcade fun out of it, then you might be able to get something if for some reason you like zombies. The third DLC is called Blood Ties, and in that one, Lara is exploring Croft Manor, trying to find the deed to the manor or whatever documents she can find that will prove the manor is actually hers. It's an entire DLC of nothing but puzzle solving and exploration, and you get to look into the backstory of the Croft family as you're going through the entirety of the mansion. And despite it being a bit too easy and a bit too short, it actually ends up being one of the better DLCs simply because it does what we kind of wanted from the DLCs for this thing. It expands the story. You get to look into the backstory of the Croft family a bit, and you get to understand a bit of why Lara is the way she is and why her father was the way he was when things were going on for the backstory of Rise of the Tomb Raider. And it also helps that throughout Blood Ties there are absolutely no combat encounters whatsoever, which is one of the weaker elements of the game, so that's a good thing. The same can't be said for Lara's Nightmare, which is basically the same as Blood Ties, except she's having a nightmare and she has to go through the manor in order to destroy 3 skulls of chaos in order to fight off a zombie horde that is trying to kill her and wake up. Like the Cold Darkness Awakened DLC, it is rather dumb and doesn't really fit into the main context of Rise of the Tomb Raider, but at least it makes more sense than Cold Darkness Awakened. Because it is explicitly, she is having a nightmare, none of the things that are happening in that DLC are real. Unfortunately, it's mostly combat, so it's actually a pretty weak DLC overall. But here's the thing, if you pick up the 20-year celebration version of the game, all of those DLCs are included at no extra cost. And since the 20-year celebration version is the only version of the game you can get anymore except for console releases of the original version, it's actually not a bad deal. The Baba Yaga and Blood Ties DLCs are worth playing through at the very least, and they actually do somewhat add to the overall experience of Rise of the Tomb Raider, making it a more enjoyable game as a whole. But what really matters, the core of Rise of the Tomb Raider, is just okay. It's better than the previous game. It's a step in the right direction, but they still haven't quite gotten there yet. They still have some writing problems to sort out, and they still have the combat and stealth mechanics they need to improve pretty dramatically by the time the next game comes out. But they did actually make several improvements to the formula that the reboot established, so they are definitely improving, and I am curious to see where they go with the sequel. But as for Rise of the Tomb Raider, I would definitely recommend it over the previous game in the series. You don't even really need to play the previous Tomb Raider game in order to understand Rise of the Tomb Raider, because by the time you get to Rise of the Tomb Raider, all of the events of the previous Tomb Raider are explained enough in the game to where you don't really need to look them up, and if you do want to look them up, then there's not really that much reason to play the previous game. This is where the reboot series should have started off, this level of quality. Instead, what we got was a pretty rocky start with a sequel that improves on the original quite a bit and brings it up to what I would consider a good state for a future title in the series. We'll see where it goes from there, but as for Rise of the Tomb Raider, it gets a 3.5 out of 5. Like I said, it's a decent game, it's just that it has quite a lot of problems that you have to get past in order to enjoy it. But it is definitely more enjoyable than the Tomb Raider reboot from 2013. Thanks for watching.